investment in the Dolphin tungsten mine and whether the state is likely to see a return of that money.
Okay. Any other speakers? Call on the member for Bass.
Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure this afternoon to rise and make a contribution on the Supplementary Appropriation Bill. It's really interesting. This week and last week of Parliament, after an extended summer recess, has really brought to light the reality of the circumstances that this government have taken Tasmania. I made a comment last week that the delayed start or the extended start to come back to Parliament, I think the government or the Premier had hoped that it would ensure a delayed scrutiny, delayed responsibility for this government, and they might be able to hide from the realities that we find ourselves in. But when year on year, time and again, this government failed to be honest about the circumstances that Tasmanians are in because of their government mismanagement, and when this government failed to heed the warnings presented by so many different commentators and in fact their own Treasury, there was always going to be that we would find ourselves in the most excruciating financial circumstances that Tasmania has ever experienced. Only weeks after I arrived in this place, the Fiscal Sustainability Report was released, and a number of members have referred to that because we all read it. We all wanted to see what the Treasury was actually recommending to this government, most importantly to see if the government would respond. But Treasurers, successive Treasurers and the Premier failed to heed those warnings, where it set out very clearly that if this government continue on the path that it was on, there were 4 options of correction available to them, but if they just continued to ignore the realities of the circumstances, not only would the situation get worse, but it would be harder to correct. Now, this government launched into their strong plan. They've launched into their 4th 100-day plan, as I mentioned before, down in the weeds, tripping over each other, not being able to lift themselves up to see what they could do and how they could act responsibly in Tasmania's best interests. They have now seemingly scrapped their strong plan, and they're talking about this pathway to surplus. Now, Treasurer's in the room right now. I have asked the Treasurer before, other people have asked the Treasurer, map out this pathway, this magical, mystical pathway to surplus. If you can't state year on year or even half year on half year what your pathway looks like, it doesn't exist. If you can't actually articulate it in financial terms, it's not real. If it was real, if this government had a pathway to surplus and a strong plan, they wouldn't needed to have in recent days announced this distracting and desperate policy to sell off Tasmania's future in privatisation, because if they had a plan, they wouldn't be so desperate to sell valuable assets of Tasmania and put ourselves in even a worse situation in the future. The other thing that I understand, but I don't think the Premier understands, the one thing that is difficult for people to understand if they're financially thoughtful is a Premier who says that he's going to sell off Tasmania's future, privatise the important and valuable assets of Tasmania and stick it in a future fund. Actually, last week, not only did he call it a future fund, but he called it a sovereign wealth fund, and then in the next breath says to pay off debt. The only reason why you would contemplate selling something of value to put in a future fund is to invest it, and they say it themselves, invest it into future assets, future financial returning assets. But this government are in such a poor position financially that we find ourselves only months after the bringing down of the budget that they have a supplementary appropriation for significant amounts of money to sell off valuable assets of Tasmania, to put not in a future fund, let's be honest again, but in order to pay down the debt that you have put us in, is irresponsible and lacking vision and foresight. The Premier's been the Premier for 3 financial years now. The last 3 financial years, Tasmania has experienced the worst financial outcomes. We are in a worse position in debt and a worse position in our deficit than we have ever been before. The same 3 years that this Premier has led Tasmania. Those 3 years, the Premier, since he's been a minority leader in this Parliament, have lost 6,000 full-time jobs in Tasmania. There is no way that in this place we can continue to grow economically and strengthen the position of Tasmania, where jobs are being lost, people are fleeing Tasmania, the economic circumstances are flatlining, and this government seeks to sell off those things that are valuable and contribute to the ongoing opportunities in the economy in Tasmania. Now, to speak specifically to the supplementary appropriation and to some of the concerns that have been presented, and actually a number of members have just spoken about it, the insult to Tasmania, where members on this side and the crossbench say to the government at the time of bringing down a budget, we do not believe you. We do not believe that the things that you have put either in the current year or across the forward estimates are actually possible for you to deliver. We know that you will need to come back and amend this over time. But the government seeks, in the time where they deliver their budget, to misrepresent the reality of the demands on services, the costs of delivering those services. They undercook it in the budget in order to paint a positive picture in the moment, and then have to come back, like they do now and like they're doing more and more often, to have these supplementary appropriations. Back in the day, and it's really interesting, we've got Casey in the chamber now, just new to the parliament. It would appear when you're new to a parliament that these things are normal. Supplementary appropriations should not be normal. They should not be as normalised as they are in this parliament. Like when I came into the parliament, proroguing was normal. The amount of times that this government are using instruments of the parliament to cover up their mismanagement is something that Tasmanians shouldn't be, or should not need to be, becoming desensitised to. They shouldn't be something that just happen as a regular course of parliamentary activity. What we've got now is this Premier is asking this Parliament for nearly $500 million to cover out their cost blowouts just in the last 4 months since the budgets were passed. If you break that down into fundamentals, that's $4 million a day of blowouts just in the 4 months since the budget bills were passed. Now, this level of incompetence and inability to manage money, I think, has been demonstrated over the 11 years of this government, where when they came into government, they were in a strong financial position. The books in Tasmania were in a strong financial position. There was money in the bank. And now we're looking at the point where, over the forward estimates, we'll be looking to $10 billion of debt. It's extraordinary. Over these last 3 years, the worst three financial outcomes on record. Tasmanians expect more. They expect the government to be upfront. They expect the government to be honest. And one of the other things that I think is really quite disrespectful is the reference to COVID to try and get away and escape from the realities of their mismanagement and the depths of the debt that occurs. Yes, COVID happened, and I know our previous Shadow Health Minister and our Shadow Health Minister now continues to say, as others do, that the investments that were made in COVID were necessary and essential. But in terms of how much they materially make up of the debts that we're actually experiencing now, this government dishonestly represents that. The financial position of Tasmania was already deteriorating before we experienced COVID, and has more rapidly deteriorated since. There are a number of people that are commenting around Tasmania's position. We have got signals of concern coming out from a whole number of experts in this space. Saul Estlake has been named a number of times and is now being engaged by the government to look at and make recommendations around certain things to do with the Parliament and the government's privatisation agenda. But we've got Moody's, we've got S&P, we've got CommSec, we've got Deloitte, we've got Access Economics, all talking about the negative circumstances that Tasmania find themselves in now. With the amount that we have to pay annually just to cover the interest of the debt is phenomenal, and that amount will just continue to grow. And in fact, one of the things that I was astounded to, sometimes you know something's bad, and then when you read it or you hear it, you get the real understanding of how bad it is. So specifically, when the revised estimates reports came out, not that long after the original budget, the revenues were revised up by $49.7 million, so let's say $50 million, and by 723 over the budget and forward estimates. Expenses, so that was budget about $50 million. The expenses have been revised up by $553 million, over $1 billion over the forward estimates. So for every dollar that the government has increased in revenues, they're going to spend 10 times that. It's extraordinary, the lack of constraint, the lack of financial responsibility that this government, this Premier, think that Tasmanians will allow them to get away with. There are some very specific overruns and blowouts in the budget that have been identified by others already, where we know that when it was presented in the budget and the forward estimates, people questioned at that time, they questioned in estimate scrutiny that you couldn't possibly see that downgrading of expenses and expect it to be real. And we said at that time, we knew people would have to come back with this supplementary appropriation. Tasmanian Labor expect this government to continue to be, not to continue, we don't expect that. We don't actually have any confidence or trust that they will continue. We ask this government, we demand of this government on behalf of Tasmanians that you begin to be honest about the circumstances that you have created for Tasmanians, and that you begin to, that you stop throwing up distractions and you start to actually get to work on correcting the circumstances that we find ourselves in. There's no doubt that the announcement around red tape reduction, whether it be announcement about privatisation, whatever the announcements that this government are making, they're actually trying to flurry people away from the simple task that this government needs to focus on, which is their expenditure. They need to figure out how they can properly run our GBEs and our state-owned companies. And I know that we've been saying, and our leader this morning said, if you guys don't know how to run the GBEs well, stand out of the way so a good performing government can actually operate and deliver with those GBEs. Because the reality is, just because you can't do it doesn't mean a good government can't. And we know that just because you can't manage the budget doesn't mean a good performing government can't. So Tasmanian Labor, we don't want to hear about a future fund. It's a furphy. It's just a way of you seeking to try and sell off valuable assets to pay down debt. We don't believe in your pathway to surplus. And unless you can actually paint a picture and in financial terms, year on year, outline how you're going to achieve a pathway to surplus, it doesn't exist. It's just mythical. We know that your strong plan is destroyed, like you've destroyed our budget, and at the moment, in desperation, the only possible thing that you can think to do is to sell Tasmania's future by privatising our significant and valuable assets. It was interesting that last week the Premier almost made an admission about how he had wrecked the budget. He almost made an admission about how out of control debt is, but unbelievably decided that the only thing he could possibly do was to sell off our assets. This is a Premier that's been the Premier for 3 years over Tasmania's 3 worst financial outcomes. This is a Premier who has led across the loss of 6,000 full-time jobs in the Tasmanian economy. If the Premier's privatisation agenda, it won't be, but if it was successful, we know that over the past 10 years, government businesses have actually returned to the Tasmanian budget and therefore activated the economy over $4 billion worth of dividends and made payments to help fund our schools, fund our hospitals and our emergency services. We know over those past 10 years, MAIB have provided nearly $1 billion in dividends and other returns that have helped fund our schools, our hospitals and emergency services. And over those same 10 years, TasNetworks have provided nearly $500 million in dividends and hundreds of millions of dollars more in other returns and provided critical equity to support Hydro, Tasrail and STT. This government have got to start being real, being honest and actually getting to the task of correcting the massive mess that they have made with the Tasmanian budget. This supplementary appropriation came as no surprise. We signalled...
Can I just clarify, what's a quorum? Just interested, just bringing attention to the state of the House. The government is here asking for nearly $470 million and they don't even have enough members in the House.
I call to your attention.
One member's in the chair, so this normally would have been 3.
Quorum. Bells.
I want to keep speaking. Do I go back to my seat or just down there? Doesn't matter. Do I go back to my seat?
Don't. Well,
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. So just prior to the quorum being called, and it is an interesting point, we've had 8 or 9 members of the chamber have stood to speak on the supplementary appropriation bill this afternoon because it's critically important to the state of Tasmania. It's critically important to scrutinise and prosecute the inability of this government to manage their finances, so much so that they're seeking this place to support a significant supplementary appropriation, because they undercooked and underestimated the demands required from the Tasmanian budget. Yet, on the other side of the place, the government, the minority Liberal government of Tasmania, led by a Premier who's overseen the three worst financial years in Tasmania's history for the 3 years that he's been the Premier, has only had the Treasurer rise to speak on this afternoon. One member from government around the supplementary appropriation. That is actually quite unbelievable. This government don't take their financial mismanagement seriously enough to stand and defend it. They don't take it seriously enough to rise and say why it's critical. They don't.
Call your attention to the state of the House again, Acting Speaker. This is ridiculous. They're asking for a significant amount of money.
Thank you.
And they can't even have enough members in here, giving the courtesy of the chamber.
Thank you, a member for Clark. Quorum present, stop the bills. Call on the member for Bass.
You're asking for a lot of money. The least you can do is speak.
Shadow Treasurer Josh Willey announcing across the chamber, the government is asking for a lot of money in this supplementary appropriation. The least this government could do is take it seriously and be in the chamber while debate occurs. Only the Treasurer of Tasmania has risen to stand to the supplementary appropriation, despite multiple members of the crossbench and our side of the House standing to outline how significant and serious it is that a government only months into their financial budget are calling for almost almost $500 million. So, Deputy Speaker, the government don't have a strong plan. That's ripped to shreds. They think they want to invest in a future fund, but we know that they just want to try to sell off Tasmania's future to pay down the debt that they have created with their big mess. They don't have a pathway to surplus. They can't manage money. They've demonstrated that over previous 3 years, they've continued to drive Tasmania into the worst financial position on record. The government need to put up more speakers to defend their position and to outline why Tasmanians should trust them with the finances of this state. Tasmanian Labor have high expectations of this government to do the right thing and to start being honest. If you can't be honest with Tasmanians about the financial circumstances of this state and your inability to manage the budget, then Tasmanians will keep continuing to ask the questions of you and require scrutiny of your future expectations of the budget. When we come into the budget in May, you cannot expect that this place will not expect that you make confident and serious assumptions in your budget, that your future expenses in the forward estimates are actually real and reflect the reality of the demands on the services in Tasmania. If you think that Tasmanians will accept the sell-off of their future to try and cover up your budget reality, then you are poorly misplaced and poorly misled. Tasmanians won't accept it. They won't accept you selling off their valuable assets to try and protect your political deterioration and sell off the future